At the end of the 10th century, an envoy of the Baghdad Caliph heads north and accidentally becomes part of a Viking squad. Together they must fight an ancient horror, a tribe that comes with the fog and claims human lives. This is the movie, The 13th Warrior. Ahmed ibn Fadlan served as a poet at the court of Baghdad, but by becoming infatuated with the wife of an influential nobleman, he brought down the wrath of a jealous husband. The nobleman complained to the caliph, who sent Ahmed to the lands of the Vikings as an ambassador. For long months of travel, he spent his time alongside his companion and mentor Melchizedek, pushing deeper into unfamiliar lands, until one day their path led to a wide river, along which a vessel of unusual shape slowly moved. Changing his clothes and tidying himself up, Ahmed decides to present himself before the chieftain of the Northerners. Together with Melchizedek, he enters a large tent, expecting an official reception, but immediately finds out that it is impossible to be presented to the king. He has died, and they have arrived right in time for his wake. Power has passed to Buliwyf, who asks Ahmed to recite a poem of praise in his honor. A sudden fight and the death of Buliwyf's rival for power shock Ahmed, but he is even more struck by the funeral ritual. The Northerners burn the body of the deceased king along with his wife, who voluntarily follows her husband on his final journey, and asks the gods to accept her into Valhalla before her death. The next morning, upon seeing how the Northerners wash themselves, Ahmed decides to skip this step of getting acquainted with their culture. Soon a messenger arrives in the camp, delivering a message from King Hrothgar. He asks for help because his people are suffering from attacks by an ancient horror that forbidden to speak of out loud. To decide how to act, Buliwyf turns to an oracle. She predicts that only 13 warriors can save Hrothgar and his people, a number that must correspond to the months of the year. She names no one, leaving the Northerners to decide for themselves who will embark on the journey. One after another, the warriors step out of the circle and proudly state their names. When 12 chosen ones stand, the oracle announces that the last warrior cannot be a Northerner. The crowd turns toward the Arab, and it becomes clear whom fate has designated to be the last. Accepting the will of the gods, they begin preparing for the expedition. The Vikings are genuinely amused by his small horse, and are curious about his name, but the long Ahmed ibn Fadlan ibn Abbas ibn Rashid proves far too complex for them, so they shorten it to just one word, Ibn. A long journey to the north begins. Day replaces night, and Ahmed tries to memorize the sounds of their speech to understand these harsh men. Gradually, he starts to grasp the meaning, and one day, when Wiglaf permits himself a dirty insult directed at his mother, Ahmed, to everyone's surprise, calmly replies that unlike Wiglaf, he actually knows who his father is. Fed up with the teasing about his horse, Ahmed demonstrates to the Northerners what an Arabian steed is capable of. Despite its size, it easily clears obstacles, one of which happens to be Sven. A few days later, they cross a raging sea and soon find themselves in fog-shrouded waters that make navigation difficult. With a booming voice, Buliwyf tries to shout toward the shore, and soon a bonfire appears through the mist, guiding their way. They disembark, and Arian hands Ahmed a sword that proves far too heavy for him. The guide who meets them leads the squad to a settlement whose pitiful state depresses them. There are no walls or moats around, and among the inhabitants, young men are hardly to be seen. King Hrothgar meets the guests and speaks of the attacks. However, the squad does not believe what the old man says, and Buliwyf sends Herger on reconnaissance. At that moment, Ahmed notices a boy running out of the woods, and they rush to him. The queen recognizes the child. He is from a neighboring farmstead, and she decides to guide them there. Trying not to make a sound, they dismount and head toward the house through the gloom of the forest. Surrounding it, the Vikings burst inside, but discover no living souls. After making sure the house is empty, Ahmed steps inside. The slaughter he witnesses forces him to empty his stomach. Finally, Arian names those who committed these murders. They are called the Wendal, and it is said that they feed upon the dead. Furthermore, they come with the fog and leave virtually no tracks behind, making them nearly impossible to hunt down. From a conversation with the king, it becomes clear that connections with neighboring settlements have long been lost, and their lands are effectively cut off from the rest of the world. Ahmed notices that the Vikings are not touching the alcohol. The king's son says that Buliwyf is brave, but he has not yet had to face the Wendel. In response, Buliwyf remarks that no one has heard of the prince's valor either, aside from tales of how he killed his own brothers. These words sting the prince, and to dispel any doubts, Hrothgar orders the last survivor of the attack on Eastwick to be brought in. The old man relates that the attackers resemble bears. They are wrapped in pelts and armed with long claws. The Wendel arrive along with the fog, and before them sometimes appears what people call the glowing serpent. Soon Hrothgar reports to Buliwyf that fog is starting to roll down from the hills, and realizing that time has almost run out, the warriors herd all the villagers into the great hall and prepare for battle. Ahmed is surprised by the calm with which the Vikings prepare to sleep before a prospective fight. Arion says that the chain of every man's life was forged long ago, and everything will happen as intended. Therefore, there is no need to fear death. The most important thing is to meet it with dignity. Without realizing it, Ahmed falls asleep, but waking in the middle of the night, he realizes that none of the warriors are actually sleeping, and the steady snoring is merely a ruse meant to deceive the enemy. Unexpectedly, the thin walls of the house splinter like kindling, and the Wendel breach the interior. In pitch darkness, a battle breaks out, and despite the barbarians' numerical superiority, they fail to crush the resistance. Ahmed, having not yet adapted to the heavy sword, suffers a wound, but he inflicts a wound on his opponent as well, who flings him aside like a rag doll. Then the battle ends as suddenly as it began. Even though the attack was repelled, the squad loses 2 warriors, and the Wendel carry away their heads. But what strikes the Northerners most of all is something else. Everyone is certain he struck at least one of the attackers, yet after the battle, they find not a single corpse of the barbarians. This fact unnerves them, instilling in some the belief that the Wendel are not human. Helga tends to Ahmed's wound, while Buliwyf comes to the conclusion that without fortifications, the settlement cannot withstand the attacks of the Wendel, and with the arrival of morning, the entire population begins construction. Having failed to adapt to the heavy sword, Ahmed decides to reshape it into a lightweight blade. Helga, who arrives to inspect the Arab's wounds, warns him to beware of Prince Wiglaf, who is persuading the king that Buliwyf intends to strip him of his power. Ahmed assures the girl that this is not true, but still decides to warn Buliwyf. After listening to him, Buliwyf suggests teaching the prince a lesson, and Hrothgar takes the task upon himself. Waiting until one of the prince's friends joins the construction work, Hrothgar deliberately provokes him, prompting Angus to challenge Hrothgar to a duel. Ahmed realizes that Angus is younger and stronger than Hrothgar, but stopping them is no longer possible. The rivals take their positions, and Angus repeatedly rains down blows that Hrothgar parries with immense difficulty. The more powerful opponent shatters all 3 shields granted to Hrothgar by the rules, leaving him virtually no chance. Finally, an exhausted Hrothgar pauses to catch his breath. Wiglaf signals Angus to finish him off, but in a split second, everything changes. Hrothgar, who had feigned helplessness, dodges and decapitates his opponent with a single blow. Only now does Ahmed realize that Hrothgar could have killed Angus right away, but deliberately held back, wanting to show the prince that what one should fear most is what one cannot see. Reaching Hrothgar, who is monitoring the approaches to the settlement, Ahmed hears a distant thunder, but the Viking explains that it is not the sky, but waves crashing against Thundercliff. Suddenly, the air fills with the sound of horns calling to battle, and Hrothgar spots the glowing serpent stretching along the mountainside. He warns the people of the danger and rushes back alongside Ahmed. Once inside the settlement, Ahmed notices a little girl in the field who failed to seek cover behind the fence in time. He races toward her, and as he draws closer, he realizes that the glowing serpent is actually the Wendel riding with torches. With the arrival of darkness, the Wendel launch their attack, advancing on the village and hurling burning torches in an attempt to sow panic among the defenders. Soon, several groups of Wendel manage to penetrate the perimeter, and entering into combat with one of them, Ahmed realizes that before him stands not a monster, but a man who can be killed. The veil of fear falls from his eyes, and he hurls himself at the enemy, cutting down one after another. The Wendel remove a cart serving as a gate and burst into the settlement. To stop the charging barbarians, Buliwyf orders Ahmed to stand beside him and brace a log with his foot. The plan works, and they manage to overturn the ragged line of the Wendel, just as the familiar sound of a horn echoes through the air. As if on command, they halt the attack and retreat from the settlement, leaving behind only fire and destruction, while Buliwyf's squad loses 4 more men. The next morning, the Northerners conclude that the Wendel, just like ordinary people, must live somewhere, which means they can be tracked down and struck at their lair. However, there are far too few warriors left, so the queen leads Buliwyf to a local witch. The old woman tells them that they cannot defeat all the Wendel, and the only way to stop them is to kill their chieftain and the mother they worship. Soon after, the remaining members of the squad set off and push deep into the forest. Confident in their superiority, the Wendel do not even try to hide their tracks, and following them, the Vikings approach their lair. Spotting a cave in the cliff, they silently kill the guards and penetrate inside while remaining unnoticed. Herger gestures for his comrades to strip off their armor, which makes far too much noise, after which the group moves deeper through the underground tunnels. They are forced to literally crawl right under the noses of the savages, and after bypassing the second line of guards, the squad finds itself at a sacrificial altar whose walls are lined with the skulls of the slain. Yet this is merely the first level, and to reach the mother of the Wendel, they must bypass another group of guards. Realizing that passing unnoticed will not work this time, Buliwyf decides to descend lower under the cover of a waterfall. They manage to pull it off, and are now able to attack the enemies from the rear. A lightning-fast strike brings success, leaving the entrance to the mother of the Wendel's chambers unguarded. However, breaching silently proved impossible, so Herger asks Buliwyf to finish what was started. The rest decide to hold off the savages rushing to their sovereign, taking advantage of the fact that the enemy's numerical superiority loses its power in the narrow underground tunnels. Stepping inside, Buliwyf kills a priest and finds himself one-on-one with the queen. Armed only with a poisoned claw, the wild woman proves quick and agile. She manages to wound Buliwyf, but he decapitates her nonetheless. Meanwhile, the Wendel grow in numbers, and realizing that holding back their onslaught is impossible, the Northerners decide to follow a stream in hopes of finding a way to safety. Wounded, Haltuf realizes that his journey has come to an end, and decides to stay behind to hold off the pursuers. However, Herger soon notices that the stream disappears under the rocks, and the squad prepares to make a final stand and die with honor. Yet the roar of the waves makes them realize they are beneath Thundercliff, and their only chance to survive is to attempt to swim under the rock, hoping to reach the surface near the cliff. Stripping off their remaining gear, they dive underwater, swim through the darkness beneath the rock, and soon surface into the open air. However, the wound inflicted by the queen does not pass without consequence, and Buliwyf is slowly fading away. With bitterness in his voice, he declares that he will die as a beggar. He believes that a man can only be considered rich if someone composes sagas of his deeds. Ahmed hints to him that he will most certainly be considered rich. Herger advises the Arab to rest, as he is certain that the Wendel will attack today to seek revenge. They killed their mother, but the chieftain is still alive, and only by killing him can they break the Wendel's spirit. Just as Ahmed tries to object, confident that there will be no fog today, the very same sound of the horn cuts through the air. The villagers hastily take up defensive positions, while the queen begs Helga to prevent the children from falling into the hands of the Wendel alive, no matter what. While the people prepare for battle, and Ahmed prays to God to help him live out the final minutes of his life with dignity, the Wendel begin preparing their attack. Suddenly, everyone freezes, as Buliwyf steps out onto the rampart, resolved to die like a true warrior. Exhausted, mortally wounded, yet devoid of fear, he decides not to die in bed, but with a sword in his hands like a true warrior. Taking his place at the center of the defense, Buliwyf recites a prayer to the gods, and the rest of the Northerners join in, asking the higher powers to welcome them into the halls of Valhalla. Hardly have the final words of the prayer died away in the air when the Wendel crashed down upon them. The neighing of horses, the groans of the wounded, the clashing of blades, everything merges into a single roar as the Northerners and the Arab, determined to sell their lives dearly, fight like angels of death, cutting down one enemy after another. Spotted by Buliwyf, the chieftain of the Wendel charges at him, but the Northerner knocks the barbarian off his horse with a single sword strike and finishes him on the ground. The chieftain's death cry echoes through the ranks of the savages, and realizing that they are left without a leader, they begin to retreat. The death of the chieftain becomes their signal to flee, and the Wendel retreat, leaving King Hrothgar's kingdom in peace forever. Just when it seemed that nothing could cloud the people's relief, the howling of a dog announces the death of Buliwyf, who exhausted his last remaining strength in the battle against the savages. As Hrothgar promised, he is buried as a king, while Ahmed ibn Fadlan returns to his homeland and writes down the saga of the Northerners, immortalizing the name of Buliwyf, who sacrificed his life to protect the weak and oppressed. Ahmed ibn Fadlan traveled to the Northerners as a stranger, but became a brother in arms among those who hesitate for not a moment to sacrifice themselves for their own. There, amid the cold and the harsh warriors, he found himself, a man who learned to look death in the eye without fear.